This is the Great War Discussion Group. The speaker for today is Terry Collins, who, as you know, from previous years, has been interested in and lecturing on various sorts of aircraft in World War One. His particular topic today is lighter than air aircraft, something which seems to have been a real characteristic of World War One, thanks to the Zeppelins and the observation balloons and all of the maturing technology of balloons and dirigibles, which characterized the war. I think we're seeing a bit of a recrudescence in interest in lighter than air vehicles, but they've never really gone away. And Terry will tell us what sort of role they played in World War One. Terry, you're on.
I'm on. Hello, my name is Terry Collins, and for those of you who don't know me, I have a background and long interest in military history and an avid war gamer. I am an electrical engineer and will over-explain everything, and you'll have to bear with me on that. I retired from Honeywell in 2013 and the Army Reserve in 2005, where I was a research and development scientist of all things. I'm a volunteer at the World War I Museum, as well as a member of the League of World War I Aviation. That being said, this presentation is based on my interpretation of publicly available resources and has not been reviewed or authorized by any organization that I have been a member to now or in the past. The museum's always happy about that part. So we're going to go through an introduction. We're going to talk about terminology, issues, and challenges of lighter than air. We're going to look at lighter than air aircraft up to 1914. Then we're going to start looking at specifics. We're going to look at kite balloons. Everybody's probably seen them many times in pictures. And then we're going to talk about non-rigid airships, which is basically the British way, and then rigid airships, the German way. And then we're going to have a summary and questions. I'm open to questions at any time, but we'll definitely have question and answer at the end. Oh, wrong way. Everybody has seen lighter than air aircraft. So these are variations on a theme. That's a balloon as opposed to a kite balloon. Kite balloon is tethered. Balloon is not, but it has no propulsion other than up and down. This is everybody's favorite Goodyear balloon that everybody's seen over the, and we'll end our discussion talking about those kind of balloons. And that is your basic Zeppelin from World War One, and we'll talk about those in some detail. Like I said, the terminology, the gas bag, where the in this case hydrogen is kept, is a container for the gas, hydrogen. Now in World War One, hydrogen was the only gas used because helium had just been discovered 2 years earlier and not available in sufficient quantities to use in the war. That doesn't happen until the 1920s. And you'll see that, and it's interesting. And that's a whole interesting discussion beyond this presentation. Like I said, a balloon is a balloon, like everybody's seen at balloon fests, are lighter than aircraft. They have no propulsion or steering. They basically go up, and the way they steer them is going up and down, going with wherever the wind goes. So that as the wind changes, they go up and down. A kite balloon, on the other hand, is tethered and generally used for observation, literally for observation. When you see one in today, you'll see if you see a tethered balloon today, it's being used to look at something because they can stay up there for a very, very long time and look at things from above. An airship, on the other hand, is a lighter than aircraft, lighter than aircraft craft with propulsion and steering. That pretty much defines the class of everything we're going to talk about here, except for the kite balloon. A pressure airship is an airship that's maintained by the gas pressure using what they call ballonets. Ballonets are regular air that's forced into the envelope in a smaller envelope to maintain the pressure within the envelope as they go up and down, because the pressure because the hydrogen is so much lighter, they have to replace some of that weight, and when they're down low, when it's not very much, or when it's very compressed with air, and then as they rise and that hydrogen expands, they get rid of the air using valves. It's a very complicated system, and we'll allude to it, but we won't go into much more detail than that. A non-rigid airship, better known as a blimp, normally referred to as a blimp, is a pressure airship with propulsion and steering. That's all it is. And we'll talk about those in some detail. And then, of course, a rigid airship, everybody knows, has seen before, is a non-pressure airship. That means they use an external frame to hold the shape of the aircraft together, and the balloons expand or shrink internal to the airship. Now, what makes lighter than aircraft different than regular aircraft? In a regular aircraft, the lift is created by moving air over the wings to provide lift. Well, the lift in a lighter than aircraft is done by the use of a lighter gas, in the case of one, hydrogen, which displaces the oxygen and rises because it's lighter. The larger and more gas bags, the larger the aircraft. The colder than higher, the larger the lift. To a point. To a point. All aircraft have a maximum height due to not the temperature, but that larger lift is because the gas is expanding and your envelopes are only so big, so they have to release the gas to keep the gas bags from rupturing. The problem with that is now they don't have as much hydrogen in there. They can't create hydrogen on the fly. So when you start releasing those and going down, you have less lift than you started with because you've released some of the hydrogen. Pressure altitude is the maximum altitude an airship can go without releasing that gas. Like I said, when it gets to a certain point, the gas is fully expanded. The original gas is fully expanded, and the envelope can't get any bigger; it will tear. So beyond that, so that is its pressure altitude. It can go higher because what they could do is release the gas or weight, ballast, and it'll go up higher. But like I already described the problem, and it can be done dynamically, the way a plane is. It uses engines and uses the craft in some form to create regular lift like you see in an airplane. Modern balloons or airships are very much like that. They're dynamically shaped in such a way that they can create an airfoil on top of the lift and be able to maneuver around, but you don't see it much during World War One. Altitude is controlled by either releasing ballast, usually in the form of water, to go up and hydrogen to go down. Pretty straightforward. The problem is you only got so much water and so much hydrogen. So when you run out, then you've got a problem. This is particularly important if you're having trouble with your envelopes being ruptured for some reason, generally hostile action, and you're starting to run out of hydrogen, and you're going to start going, and you're going to try to release all the ballast you can, and eventually you run out of things that you can throw off water, and you start throwing things off the balloon, including people in the famous movie. Endurance. The big advantage, the absolute biggest advantage of lighter than aircraft is endurance. And a lighter than aircraft can stay up for much longer. As proven in the 30s, you could fly them around the world for all intents and purposes. There's nothing stop. I mean, they got to stop for fuel for the engines and food for the people, but generally it can stay up for an exceptionally long time. The breakdowns and repairs, if the engines break down, they just stop in the air and guys go out and fix the engines. Any damage it's made, they can repair from inside. So it is not unusual in World War One for Zeppelins. Zeppelins routinely flew 48 hours or more, and there was one mission where they were going to fly all the way to Africa and meet up with the German troops in Africa. Uh, that's how, I mean, it was going to take better part of a week. The problem turned out not to be the airship. It turned out to be the weather, particularly the hot weather of the Sahara Desert. A useful lift, just like every other thing, airplanes are limited by how much thrust, there's so much thrust, so much wing design, so much weight, so much drag. An airship is limited similarly. It is limited by its weight and the total volume of gas. So the airship itself has a weight. And as long as the weight of the airship is less than the gas, the airship will go up. So that's its and the difference between what it takes to just lift the aircraft and anything you put on it is called the useful lift. And we'll talk a lot about useful lift because useful lift includes things like people, weaponry, bombs, fuel, things that aren't going to come home, or well, that don't involve actually part of the aircraft. As I said before, hydrogen is used because it's the lightest of all gases. Nothing is lighter. It's a highly flammable gas, as most people know. And like I said, helium is unavailable. The only place in the world generally that you can get helium even today is the United States. There's places, it's a byproduct of natural gas in Oklahoma and Texas for whatever reason it is. And but its usefulness did not get recognized until after the war. Another major issue with the lighter than aircraft, it is highly susceptible to weather, particularly gusty winds. It can handle high winds, kind of, as long as they're nice and steady high winds. They can use them just like an aircraft does. But gusty winds tend to catch it, and there are accidents where they folded the Zeppelins in half, slammed them into the ground, slammed them into an obstacle, or just blew it out in the sea. Just let it, pushed it down into the water. Weather is highly unpredictable at over 10,000 feet, which is where most of the Zeppelins operated, and usually is significantly higher. It's usually at least double what surface winds are. Another issue the Germans had on weather is they have no weather prediction. The weather in Europe tends to go from west to east, comes from Britain toward Germany. Germans don't have any weather stations beyond the continent, so they have no idea what the weather in Ireland, for example, is like when even though the weather in Ireland is going to eventually be the weather in England, which is going to eventually be the weather in Germany. So they don't really know until it gets over the North Sea what the weather is going to be like. So sudden storms are notorious. I mean, they had notorious problems with sudden storms coming in and over Britain. Another thing is altitude. Many of the airships operated at altitudes of extreme cold and limited oxygen over lengthy periods of time. The Zeppelin itself doesn't really care, but the people on the Zeppelin have a real problem because humans are not used to having extremely limited oxygen at high altitudes in extreme cold. You're talking about sitting on top of a mountain is a very inhospitable place for most humans. So that became a very good issue. One of the side notes about hydrogen, as I said, it's the lightest of all gas. It only has one proton in the molecule, which means it can seep through almost any material, no matter what almost until you had plastics. they would seep through almost any material, no matter how impervious it seemed like. And the only material that they ever could figure out that could hold hydrogen for any length of time is gold beater skin. And if you're not familiar with what gold beater skin is, it is the larger intestine of a cow. It is because I mean, it has to keep methane and things like that. And so and they use it to beat gold with it. That's what they use to beat gold with. And that's what they use to make the envelopes for the aircraft, but lighter than aircraft. A typical Zeppelin gas cell took about 50,000 of these intestine pieces to build just a single envelope. And we're going to talk about aircraft that have 15 to 19 of those envelopes. So you can imagine how many cows that takes to build these. And the British had the same problem until you have this problem until the advent of plastics. Lighter than air aircraft up to 1914. Everybody's probably heard of Montgolfier's first balloon flight, 1783. Get up. It's a hot air balloon. Goes up, goes down. In fact, I think it was even tethered. By 1862, the militaries have started seeing in fact, actually before that, right, the French Army used it, played around with the idea in Napoleonic periods, but the Union Army actually brought it into fruition. There's the Intrepid, the Union Army balloon, which they used to see the Confederate maneuvering in 1862. Now, it has a particular note in the history of what we're talking about, because there was a young German officer who was seconded to the Union Army as an observer, as it often is with foreign observers, to watch it. And his name happens to be von Zeppelin. And that's where he saw the first balloon is there. And then he stayed in the United States talking to the guys that made the Intrepid for about a year and a half to 2 years. And he was fascinated by it. But then he went back to his general staff position in the German army. And we'll talk about that later. By 1908, you see a non-rigid balloon. It's basically no different than a helium balloon of today. It's basically they make it pointy ended, so it tends to stay stable in the wind. That's why it's pointed on the ends. And they didn't have anything that they couldn't figure out what to use. Well, what to use them for? But they used them as advertisements, flying advertisements, just like we put them behind the planes. They use them as flying advertisements. And finally, in 1911, the DeLog company used the passenger airship, commissioned the passenger airship Deutschland in 1911. It's the first passenger airship. It was built by the Zeppelin company, which had been formed right around 1900 by von Zeppelin. And you'll notice its shape is generally the same shape you'll see from now on in Zeppelins. First thing we're going to talk about is a kite balloon. A kite balloon is basically a balloon filled with hydrogen. Okay, and they're used by all the different countries. And if you've ever seen a battle picture, they always have kite balloons up because kite balloons are used to observe enemy movements and direct artillery fire. It has a single envelope, and the tails, despite what they look like, are filled with air. The purpose of the tails is to swing them around so that they're pointed into the wind. That way, they're relatively stable, so that the observers can and they can stay up for most of the day. I mean, they're filled with hydrogen on site, manufactured on site sometimes, and sometimes they bring it in tanks. They're tethered, they're winched to altitude, usually have a couple of observers. They have a telephone line down the winch line so they can talk to the ground and do the artillery fire. If they see an enemy aircraft, they can winch them down pretty fast, and although not fast enough because they're the enemy aircraft are fast and easy. Once they got the hang of it, they could shoot them down. And then later in the war, they were the first things equipped with parachutes. What they look like, there is a German Parasol Drachen, usually just referred to as a Drachen, on the left, on my left, and a Krakow, I never can say it, on the right. That is generally what the French and other allies had. And if you happen to go into National Air and Space Museum, that's what they have there. They have one in the World War I area. Now, as is my way of doing things, I tend to have models of everything. And so, the reason I do use models is so you can compare size to the different aircraft as opposed to looking at a picture where the picture takes up the whole, no matter how big it is, it takes up the whole picture. And the models give you an idea how they are relative to each other. And that's a Drachen or a Coquette sitting, flying next to with an E2 flying around. You can see typically it's about 3 times longer than a fighter aircraft, just a little bit longer than the largest regular aircraft, bomber aircraft. Now we're going to talk about blimps, non-rigid airships. The British approach. The British started out building, just like the Germans, they started out building rigid airships. But in 1911, or in 1908, their first rigid airship was destroyed by a gust of wind, folded it in half and slammed it into the ground and destroyed it. That pretty much, the British hierarchy at that point said, no, this rigid stuff's not working out. We don't think it's ever going to work out. So they turned their focus off non-rigid airships. Now, all of that is based on that first statement. The British military was primarily concerned about finding submarines. Didn't really care about anything else. It wasn't planning on using them over the front. It wasn't planning on using them for anything else that they could think of. They couldn't think of another way to use them. So they used them to force submarines in coastal waters because Britain is surrounded by water, of course, and the submarines could come at it from any place, from any direction. So what they did is they had 19 stations around the island where they had British airships. They would go up. Now, the British airships did carry bombs, but that was not the point. What it did is force the submarines either to submerge or run, because the British submarine or the German submarines were well aware if you saw a British airship, there was a British destroyer somewhere around there too. So what it did, it forced the submarines to go under the water, which, by the way, an airship can still see the submarine under the water if the water's clear enough. And it slows it up, and more importantly, it kept it away from the surface vessels. So that was their primary mission, and that's their mission almost all the way through the war. And therefore, the non-rigid airship is much better for that. It acts just like a Goodyear blimp does over the football field. It's just watching to make sure, it's just watching. It's just observing. And as the war progressed, they kept getting bigger and bigger, more streamlined, more reliable, more powerful, more range, more endurance. But they never changed that basic mission until the Battle of Jutland. After the Battle of Jutland in the summer of 1916, the British came to realize that airships are very good at scouting over the fleet. They could stand over the fleet, and they can see much further than the ships can, and they can see enemy fleets and how they're maneuvering. Problem that the British had at the Battle of Jutland, where they lost a lot of cruisers because they were trying to find the German Navy. So they started building rigid airships based on capture or destroyed German Zeppelins, but they never got past the experimental stage in World War I. After World War I, they became the guys when it came to wrong way. Zeppelins, because the Germans were prohibited except for commercial reasons. For example, the Graf Zeppelin, passenger airliner. So the British took the lead after the war, and that's where a lot of the research is done after the war. That's what a typical. This happens to be the HMA-3 Astros Torres, one of the first airships. What's the first thing you'll notice? It's got three lobes to it. You see two of them. It looks like three sausages sitting side by side. Each of these sausages is a gas bag. And the gas bag is, they'll get bigger or smaller as the gas expands and shrinks. So one of the bags is hidden. So you have two bags at the bottom and one on top. Total gas in this is about 280,000 cubic feet. It shows you and the British, instead of it didn't make a different kind of gondola for it. They basically took two aircraft and tied their tails together, rebuilt them. And so you have two aircraft sticking out. That way you have engines at both sides to run it either direction. Hope I'm lost again. Here I am. And this is, like I said, they get bigger as you still notice in 1916, they still have the three envelopes side by side. You can very easily see the two aircraft back to back with no tail. This is a very good example of a standard mid-war airship in a gondola. It's 196 feet long and 170,000 cubic feet. Two engines. Excellent for. It's called a coastal, and it's excellent for detecting submarines. It has a range of a couple of 100 miles. They usually go out during the day or whenever, and they look around, and then they come and back to their base at night, and they either tether them if there's not going to be wind, or of all things, they hide them in the woods. They're small enough to diameter-wise, to get actually below the tops of the trees in a special clearing, usually around there, so that wind doesn't. And then they tie them down, so the wind doesn't tear them apart. This is what they start looking by 1918. Their look is a little more shaped like that. That makes it a little more streamlined as we would think of it. It's got a standard lane. The gondola starts looking like a gondola as opposed to just an airplane. And this aircraft is a direct predecessor to the Goodyear blimps of the 1930s. Yeah. It's 165 feet long and 90,000 cubic feet and two engines. You'll notice in some ways, they keep getting smaller because they can use more of them, though. You still have a problem with the gold beaters stuff that you can only have so much of that. So now we're going to talk about the German approach. The Germans had the opposite problem, the opposite idea. They said, well, that's real cool, but we don't have any submarines we don't have too many submarines around our shores, and they're mostly land-based anyway. But we do need long-range scouting. The German Navy went to a great deal of trouble to build large capital ships in the 1900 and 1914, but not very many cruisers. So they were short on cruisers, so they didn't have the scouting capability the British had. They said, we can use these airships for long-range scouting and tactical bombing. And so they built their first rigid airship, LZ-1, and you'll see that LZ from now on. LZ is the designation by the Zeppelin company. That means that's just the first one they built. They're all in numerical order, and they do not. When you see a German aircraft, a military aircraft, it will drop the Z and it'll have a different number on it because then it's by which one they bought. They didn't buy them all. So in 1911, they started the airline. Germany started an airline using Schwaben. You saw a picture of its sister ship earlier. The Army and the Navy were competing for Zeppelin programs. And it was right up until the war started in 1914, and then suddenly reality hit. The German Army lost 4 Zeppelins on scouting and bomb missions in the first week and a half. Month, I think it was. And it's showing that they due to early anti-aircraft guns and ground fire, You either got to be way high, which means you can't see very well, or you're going to have to risk these things getting shot down a lot. So the Army said, okay, enough with that. We're not going to be doing scouting anymore. We got to have something to do with all these Zeppelins. So we're going to shift to strategic bombing of England. The Navy, being the Navy, just like our Navy, not to be outdone, shifted its focus as well. It said, well, we can do this, we'll use them as scouting when the fleet's out, but otherwise we'll use them to bomb England. And but they still maintain their scouting mission. Now, when you come to the actual missions, basically what they did is the Army and Navy being not coordinating with each other, they decided to cut or put a line across England, basically right through London. They said everything south of London was Army, and everything north of London was Navy. That way, they kept out of each other's way. Why they couldn't call each other on the phone, I have no idea. So that is L11. Like I said, if it was still is under the Zeppelin company's jurisdiction, it would have an LZ and a number, but I don't know what L11 is. I'm looking it up in the book. That is basically early Zeppelin. You'll notice typically it's got a couple of special made gondolas right there. It pretty much looks like a gondola that everybody's seen. It's little machine gun nests on the top to protect it. There's also machine guns in here and in here, and typically sometimes on the tail. That is your Zeppelin. In fact, that's what it looks like when you start taking it apart. So what Zeppelin's big claim to fame when it came to making airships is he decided that if you made them exactly the same size, the whole length of most of the aircraft, then you could mass produce these struts. And you'll notice there's a dotted line and a solid line, dotted line. And inside is a gas bag. So each gas bag goes here. So you count the gas bags, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. Now, remember, the British gas bag aircraft had about 250,000 cubic feet. L10 had 1.1 million cubic feet, much higher. Notice it's almost 3 times longer, 536 feet, 61 feet in diameter, has a useful lift of 35,000 pounds. That compared to an aircraft in 1915 has a useful lift of about 200 pounds, 200 to 300 pounds. You can see why the airships were so prominent. 16 gas cells, 18 crew. I'm only going over this because you'll see this over and over again as it gets bigger. 4 Maybach. Maybach turns out to be the engine maker to this day. Most airship engines are made by Maybach to this day. I mean, the brand new ships coming out today have Maybach engines, which is a subsidiary of the Zeppelin company. Only 210 horsepower, which is a big engine in 1914, 1916. Has a maximum. One of the things that surprised me is how fast it really is. It's 57 miles an hour with a ceiling of 10,500 feet for a range of 2,700 miles. You can see why it's, this is a time period where the range of an aircraft is about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, which means it's about 100 miles or so, maybe 200 miles on it if you're lucky. This is what a worksheet would look like for this happens to be L13 at one of the sister ships of the L11. You can see all the gas bags are numbered from the back to the front. It shows you where, it says, I have that 35, I have a useful lift of, in this case, 29,000 pounds. It was mission specific because depending on the range they had to fly and how much water they had to carry, which is part of the weight of the aircraft, which drops the amount of useful lift. So here's what your breakdown of your useful lift is. First of all, there's service load. You got to have gasoline, you got to have oil, you got to have crew, you got to have ballast. Look at that, 5 tons of ballast. Spare parts, stores, free lift, so you can up and down, give it, and then 4,700 pounds of munitions, bombs, provisions, any passengers that were there, and that totals to that at 29,000 pounds. That gives you an idea of what a Zeppelin looks like. This is the Zeppelin L-30, I think it is, compared to the aircraft. Now, all of you have seen my lectures before, have seen this particular, the background. This is the maximum altitude of a fighter throughout the war, starting in 1914 at this end and 1918 at this end. And you see as the math gets higher and higher and higher, and the speed is a little arrow, and it gets faster, faster, and faster. That is the altitude relative to the planes of the Zeppelin. So it's about as high as the aircraft in 1914 and 1915 could go. Oh, there we go. Now we'll move on to what they call the super Zeppelins. They said, oh, well, we have to get higher because we are finding out that aircraft can get to us at 10,000 feet, and some of the anti-aircraft guns can get to us at 10,000 feet. So we want to move higher. So they call them super Zeppelins. And if you look at them, they're bigger around, a little bit longer, almost 2 million cubic feet, but they lightened a lot of the weight. I'm not going to go into the detail I did before. It's capable of carrying 9,000 pounds worth of bombs. Again, you're using Maybach engines, and now the ceiling is 12,500 feet. And look at the range. The range went from 2,700 miles to 4,600 miles. That puts almost everything in south of Scotland in range of the North Sea airships, the naval airships on the North Sea. They're on the Frisian coast, is where they're based, which is the coast between the Netherlands and Denmark. Slightly bigger crew, and that is, from now on, when you see a Zeppelin, that's L-30 when you see a Zeppelin in my pictures, because it's the only Zeppelin I have. So it's pretending to be littler and bigger Zeppelins, but it's there primarily to show its altitude capability. And you'll notice it goes up another 1,200 feet. It's now higher than all the planes up there. Is the center point, by the way, of the Zeppelin. So it's higher than all the other planes, at least through 1915, 1916. And so now we have to talk about a side note here that has to do with how to shoot a Zeppelin down. In 1916, what they found at the beginning of the war is that when the aircraft could get up to it, which very, very rarely could they get up to it, when they shot them, all they did was punch a hole in one side and out the other, which in a human, that's a big thing, a big thing. But in a gas bag that's 60 feet tall or 50 feet tall, it's a minor inconvenience. It's a very small hole, and that crew would go around with little packs and slap on a pack where they had a hole. So the regular bullets, even if they didn't fix it, the regular bullets would not let enough gas out of the hydrogen out to that the airship couldn't get home. And there's nothing on the aircraft that's supposed to be flammable. The crew wears rubber shoes. Anything flammable is not allowed in the main envelope or the main body of the Zeppelin. It's all made out of aluminum. There's no steel. There's no metal. Everything's aluminum or cloth. Even the belt buckles are brass. On the crews. So there's nothing to spark. So without that spark, even if the inside of the Zeppelin, even if the hydrogen leaked out of the envelope into the inside of the Zeppelin, there's nothing to start a fire and so forth, and the Zeppelin would just dissipate in the wind. So then they said, oh, well, we'll have incendiary bullets. And the incendiary bullet is what normal people call a tracer. It leaves a fiery trail where it goes. It's an incendiary bullet. And the problem they found with incendiary bullets is the incendiary bullet goes in one side, is now completely surrounded by hydrogen. There's no oxygen, so the incendiary part goes out, and then it punches out the other side. Again, it couldn't, they thought it would start a fire, but it would not. Same problem. The bullets go through and you lose some hydrogen, but nothing compared to your total, minimal compared to your total. And so therefore, no matter how much they shot at the Zeppelins till 1916, all they did was punch a lot of holes in it, which usually just made the Zeppelins irritated and they'd leave. They'd either go up or they'd just continue on because they're doing 57 miles an hour, and a DH2 in 1916 has a maximum speed of 68 miles an hour. It had to get up to 10,000 feet. By the time they heard about that, Zeppelin was long gone. They couldn't catch them in 1916. But as the planes got faster, they would be able to catch them. But they couldn't, even shooting at them had no effect. But in 1916, they developed what's called an explosive bullet. When it hits something, anything, it explodes. So what it hits the outer shell of the Zeppelin, goes through that, explodes, and that the shrapnel then makes a big hole a big hole in the envelope, and they start losing gas much more rapidly. And now it's much thicker, and now it takes less. And now, if you put a incendiary bullet with the explosive bullets in a belt of bullets, the incendiary bullets will now light the hydrogen that's outside the envelope, but inside the Zeppelin itself. And when it goes, it is a massive fire. There are pictures and drawings of one of the Zeppelins being shot down outside of London, and basically it lights up the world when one of these things goes off. You got 2 million cubic feet of hydrogen. It's a big explosion, and it burns. And by the time it gets to the ground, even the aluminum is melted, and the machine and the Zeppelin is destroyed. To give you a hint of how different it made, in the first 2 years of the war, they shot down 4 Zeppelins, and in the next year they shot down, I think, 7 Zeppelins. That's how much difference it made, and suddenly being in a Zeppelin was not a happy thing. So now we're going to go, but Germans are not going to give up that easy. So what they did is they created a new Zeppelin, the L-42. Now you'll note the big thing you'll notice about that, still using about 2 million cubic feet, still about the same size. It's actually a touch shorter. But look at the ceiling, went up to 16,500 feet with a max speed of 62 miles an hour and a range of 6,500 miles. And 6,500 miles starts putting everything in Britain under its. It can get even to the west coast of Britain, which is where the British had moved their factories, just to the west coast, up in the Manchester area and that area, and it could easily reach that. So, for what it's worth, this is what a Zeppelin looks like with its outer skin taken off. You can see the individual bags. These are individual gas cells, each individual. Some are deflated, some are more inflated. My guess is they're in the act of they're either taking the gas out or putting the gas in as part of the maintenance. And to give you an idea of with that new range, you can see, whoa, suddenly I'm a lot higher, and I'm higher than any aircraft, because you're in the next aircraft is clear up here. I took away the one that was behind it. and you don't get that till 1917. So in 1960, by then they got it figured out. So the height, and they call them the height climber. Still not high enough. Like I said, the newer aircraft came out, use of explosive bullets. Finally came the L-70 series. The L-70 series is the last of the wartime Zeppelins. And if you look at it, it looks just like a Zeppelin you would recognize pretty much from anything you've seen about Zeppelins, because it's basically the same. It's very similar design to the Graf Zeppelin or the Hindenburg or any of the Navy ships from the 1930s. It has about 10% more gas. It's a little bit longer. They added more gas bags, is what they did. Gas cells, and they're bigger. More engines, making it 80 miles an hour. It's now faster, so they can get away from the aircraft better. The range is now up to 7,500 miles. That is a long way for an aircraft any time in the war. And that shows you its approximate altitude. And even that's a SPAD. That's about as high as you can go for a World War I aircraft fighter, and it can just barely get up there. It's only got about 1,000 feet spare, and that means and what's important about that is that they had to pull, in this whole period, they had to pull fighter squadrons out of France to protect London. So, and the naval command said every fighter, the Zeppelins are worth, if nothing else, they pull fighter squadrons out of Europe, out of France. So they were happy about that. So in conclusion, the British shifted to rigid airships in 1918 and became the world's leading manufacturer. Their non-rigids became the prototypes for the Goodyear blimps of the 1920s and 30s. Despite a lot of attempts by the Allied governments to destroy the German airship industry in 1919, it turned out that other governments, like the American government, said, we'd like to have some of these. So they contracted the Zeppelin company to build airships for the United States. And because the one they were supposed to get in reparations had been destroyed. So they built them, and they continue to build them to this day. The new Goodyear blimps that you see over the stadiums today, as opposed to the 1960s, are built by the Zeppelin company in cooperation with Goodyear. So, and the new blimps are also. I saw the new the NT blimps. They're talking about having passenger service on NT blimps next year, which I find odd. It's still only about 80 miles an hour, but very comfortable. Most of my information comes from basically these two books. One's on battle bags. It's the American airships in World War One. The other one is Zeppelins in Combat, which is history of the Naval Airship Division, which is stronger of the two divisions of the German airships. And with that, any questions? Have I put everybody to sleep there?
Terry, I have one.
Terry, I was thinking that they used a lot of kite balloons with naval vessels because of their ability to see submarines, and that maybe they could see as far as 70 feet down. Was that how they were used? Were they used a lot by kite balloons by the attached to naval vessels?
I don't think that in World War II you see that a lot. The convoys would have them in World War II, but I didn't see any evidence with the British of using them very much for that purpose. They were quite satisfied just flying them off of land. I think a problem is probably the Navy's not real thrilled with having a hydrogen production facility on their ships. Would be my guess. They're probably pretty iffy about that.
Okay.
and then bringing this gigantic, what they would consider a bomb, onto their ship. They're pretty reluctant.
So basically, the British were using them at strategic points along the British coast.
Yes, like I said, there were 16 stations, basically every so many miles, all around the coast, up to Scotland, around back down on the Irish coast.
Okay, thanks for filling me in on that.
The Irish Sea coast. Sorry. One of the things that really irritated the British during the time is they asked to put some of these bases in Ireland, and needless to say, the Irish and the British not getting along since they said absolutely under no circumstance we're going to let you do that.
Well, you had crew up to what, 18 in number? Where were they?
22.
Where were they positioned?
Positions?
Yeah.
I think there are four officers in the front gondola. There's I'm thinking there's at least one mechanic, if not two mechanics, for each of the engines. And then they have everybody else is in. Well, you got repair guys, the guys that go around with the patches and stuff like that, and do the maintenance. So yeah, when you start adding that all up, it comes to that's about right, 20.
Well, I'm wondering, those that came around to fix holes, are they actually inside?
Yes, they're inside. Yes, which you can let's go back to that one where they have the inside. There's a German Zeppelin has a keel along the bottom, and they can walk on that keel and then work around on that keel. I don't think I've seen pictures of what it looks like without the gas bags, and it's actually quite, from the crew's perspective, it's a very, very open, lots of room down there, because the bags are like this. So this bottom section it's got filled with fuel tanks and water tanks and things like that, and places for the crew to be.
Okay, thank you.
Now here's an example. Ooh, this is an L-70. So you would have crews, you'd have 2 or 3 crew. They got machine guns here, so you'd have a couple of crew for that, plus an engine guy. You'd have a couple of engine mechanics on each of those 2 engines, a couple of mechanics on each of those 2 engines, plus the commander and the engine mechanics and the radio operator and the navigator. And you'll notice this little tube right here. That's how they get up into the Zeppelin.
Mm-hmm. What about oxygen?
They did use oxygen, and it's one of the first. They did use oxygen, and they carried around little bottles, unless they were in one of the gondolas. What they found, this is before the advent of aviation medicine, aeronautical medicine, whatever they call it. That aircraft that you see a lot of, it's born in this time frame. They've never had to deal with high altitude, continuous high altitude. You don't go up and so these guys are out there for 24 hours at a crack. It's not like going to the top of a mountain on the gondola and coming back down. I mean, they get air sick and altitude sickness all the time. And the oxygen didn't help them with that. So there was a lot of sickness of the crew got sick a lot because of the altitude. And the higher they went, the worse they got. The worse it got. Oh, come on. Somebody ask me a question.
Hey, Chair, I'm going to ask another question. So, what was the manufacturing process like for hydrogen?
Hold on, let me get Ken here. Say that again.
What was the manufacturing process like for hydrogen? I mean, I remember experiments in high school using an electric charge to, separate. But I've forgotten all that.
Sulfate or one of the acids, and you combine those 2 things, and hydrogen is a natural side. It releases the hydrogen. They collect it. The building in the North Sea looks about the size of a small power company building, maybe 40, 50 feet on the side with a chimney. It's fairly straightforward on the ground. We can't do it in the air, but you do it on the ground. And to the point where one of the differences between the use of helium and hydrogen is they can manufacture the hydrogen on at need. So they have a plant right there. So they could take, when they get down and they put them in maintenance, they just release the hydrogen into the air. They just let them deflate. They don't try to capture that because they know whenever they're going to they're going to spend some time working on maintenance, and then they're going to refill them from fresh hydrogen. Helium is different. Helium, you don't see them releasing helium and any more than they absolutely have to, because it's hard to come by and it's expensive. It's like 10 times or 20 times more expensive than hydrogen. Very expensive relative to hydrogen. Very hard to come by. Comes from the United States, has to be trucked in as a gas. You can't create it on the fly wherever you want it. So, I mean, I was reading some of the downsides of helium during the interwar, and I remember someplace that it took to fill the Navy Zeppelins and other airships in the 1930s. It took like 25% of the annual manufacturing capability of the industry just to fill them up. So, needless to say, the Navy was a little touchy about letting all that go and having to pay that again every time. So they always kept it in. They kept them full and didn't release. They would use the balloonettes a lot more than they did in the early war.
Thanks a lot.
Barry, looking back, has anybody ever decided, was it worth having them? Did they play any kind of a strategic role in the war? Did they make a difference?
Well, by 1917, they stopped going on raids because it was just not worth it. Once they figured out the explosive bullets in 1916, and you had fighters and fighter bombers that were capable of getting to their altitudes, then it becomes in one of the last major raids, 4 Zeppelins left Frisia headed for southern England. They were actually headed for London. They got no more than halfway there, got picked up by the British detection system, which is hearing based. It's the same places as the radar stations of World War II, but they're based on these gigantic horns, so they can listen and hear the engines from a distance. The planes went up, 4 aircraft went up. The head of the Zeppelin program was in the middle Zeppelin, and they took that out in the first 30 seconds. It went down in a heap of flames. The Zeppelins made a run for it and got away. And that was the last raid, because that was, first of all, it was the commander of the whole thing. He was killed, and their best pilots. I mean, it became a suicide mission for the Zeppelins to do that, and they just gave up. And they went back to their original mission to do scouting for the fleet, which in the late war wasn't doing anything.
You can't deny, though, that the Zeppelins made one major contribution to this war and future wars. The first strategic bombing of civilian targets was done by Zeppelins.
Yes.
And how much that had to do with the later British conviction and American conviction that strategic bombing would cause a collapse in morale in the population and would cause defeat of the enemy, questionable. The Germans never bought that particular fallacy, but we did, and the British did even more. And how much of that was due to the absolute panic of the first strategic bombing of London is hard to say.
I think the results were that the Zeppelins, they could hit a city, but if they tried to go for a particular factory, all bets were off. I mean, they had no true guiding system, aiming system. They basically got over what they thought was the target, which sometimes, I mean, when they look at the records after the war, the difference, there was a significant difference. The Zeppelins generally did not have a clue where they were, other than they looked down and it was dark, so it must be England, kind of thing. And so if they saw any lights at all, they started bombing them. So they would take out little towns because they thought they were over London, and just bomb the heck out of some little village because they had the lights on. So their experience with strategic bombing, that and plus you add the big heavy bombers, was not very good. I mean, its prime strategic value, at least in World War One, was to pull all those squadrons of aircraft out of France and to at least keep the German or the British on their toes. So they had to have the lights off at night. They had to, they had to be prepared for that. They had to have air. It took a lot of people. There's hundreds of thousands of people defending England that could have been sitting on the Western Front. So from the German perspective, that was its effect. Not that big of an effect. Not a long strategic bombing as an idea is not a particularly good thing. The Americans and British got exactly the opposite. We got, they were looking at it from the defensive side. They're looking at it, if they couldn't see us, but if you had radar or radio range finding and locations and stuff like that, if you could do that, if you could figure out how to navigate in the air so you knew where you were, and if you could figure out how to drop a bomb on a place where you wanted it to be, then strategic bombing becomes a real live problem. And I think that's what you see in the 1920s in the United States military is, for example, Millie Mitchell proving that you could take out a ship with a bomber. Okay, and even with and I read about that particular episode. Yeah, and Billy deserved to get kicked out of the military for that, by the way. The Navy put every obstacle they could put in between so that would be harder. The ships were moving. The ships, they had done it in such a way that it was harder for them, and the bombers still took them out, which gives you that thought that you had during the war, World War II. The bombers will always get through, and you can't stop them. So you have a same result, took at totally different because of the perspectives and the missions of the different militaries.
Could I just make a couple of observations? Firstly, my father could remember being woken up one Saturday night and carried into the back garden to watch what he thought was a very large cigar in the sky. And so literally I am one generation away from seeing a Zeppelin being shot down. You mentioned also Goodyear blimps at sporting events. There was an unforeseen effect of Zeppelins on one sporting event. The Grand National Steeplechase, which you're probably familiar with, has been run every year since 1839, Aintree Racecourse here in Liverpool, except in 1916, when fear of Zeppelins, they decided to move it away from Aintree to Gatwick, which was a racecourse at the time, not London's second airport. When I first saw that, I thought, well, why move it nearer to the Zeppelins? But the reason being that the whole of the Aintree racecourse, the central area, was an enormous ammunition dump. And had a Zeppelin flown over and hit that ammunition dump on race day, large numbers of casualties, and I suppose Liverpool would have had a large lake nowadays. But one final thing, at the outbreak of the war, the Royal Naval Air Service established a station for 2 blimps at Llangefni, in the middle of the island of Anglesey. For those not quite so familiar with British geography, that's island off the northwest coast of Wales. And they were employed on looking up and down the coast and support and so on, and for looking for U-boats. After the sinking of the Lusitania, it was decided to increase the size of the station, and a third blimp was to be brought in. It took off in marginal weather, which got worse and worse the nearer it got to Llangefni, and it was a howling gale by the time that the blimp got there. It attempted twice and failed to land, made one third attempt when the gondola landed on top of a cow, killing the poor animal. I've no idea what happens to the cow. I suspect it takes all round. But the aircraft, having hit the cow, bounced up into the air, went off carried by the wind towards the Atlantic Ocean. The engineer on board jumped, and his body was found next day. The other two crew members stuck with their blimp, which was being blown out into the Atlantic. When down below them, they spotted a trawler, and the two of them jumped. Of the engineer, I beg your pardon, the navigator, of him, no trace was ever found. But the skipper was spotted by the crew of the trawler, who picked him up. And so he survived, and subsequently presented the local parish church, Eglwys Cwngalsant, with two brass candlesticks engraved with gratitude and his name. And they stand to this day on the altar in the parish church. And I only know about it because 60 years later, that was the church in which Margaret and I were married, and the engravings stand out as being rather peculiar, as being in English in a Welsh language church. So I don't know if that's the first instance of a cow being killed by a lighter-than-air aircraft, but I suspect it might be.
All right. Well, on that note, why don't we go ahead and call this a conference?